The storm arrived without warning on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind that rolled off the northern moors with a fury that seemed almost personal, as though the weather itself had a grievance to settle. By the time the last of the light had gone from the sky, the roads leading to and from Ashford Park were buried under 18 inches of snow, and the nearest village was an hour's ride away in conditions that would kill a horse. Miss Cecily Hartwell had not intended to be here. She had intended to be at her cousin's house in Derbyshire, a modest but warm establishment where she would have been given a small bedroom, adequate meals, and the particular mercy of being entirely unremarkable. Instead, her carriage had lost a wheel on the long approach road to the estate, a road she had been told was a shortcut, which it was not, and her driver had spotted the lights of Ashford Park through the white curtain of the storm and made the only sensible decision available to him. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, had opened the door herself. She was a small woman with an iron bearing and kind eyes, and she had taken one look at Cecily standing on the front steps, with snow in her hair and her traveling cloak soaked through to the lining, and she had said simply, "Come in, miss. You'll catch your death." Cecily had come in. She had been given dry clothes, a gown slightly too long, and a color she would not have chosen, a deep plum that felt like it belonged to someone else's life, and she had been settled in a sitting room near the fire with tea and a plate of food that she ate with an embarrassing lack of dignity. Mrs. Alderton had watched her with quiet approval and said nothing about it. "His Grace is in residence," the housekeeper said, when Cecily had recovered enough to think about the awkwardness of her situation. "I will inform him of your presence." "Please do not trouble him tonight," Cecily said immediately. "The hour is late. I would not want to disturb him." Mrs. Alderton's expression shifted in a way that Cecily could not quite read. Something careful in it, something that suggested the question of disturbing his Grace was more complicated than it sounded. "I'll let him know in the morning, Stein," the housekeeper said, and showed her to a room that was larger than any bedroom she had slept in, with a fire already burning and curtains the color of deep water. Cecily lay in the dark and listened to the storm throw itself against the windows, and she thought, one night, she would be gone in the morning. She was not gone in the morning. The roads, Mrs. Alderton informed her over breakfast, were impassable. The snow had continued through the night. The wheel of her carriage had been examined and found to require a part that would need to come from the village. And no one was going to the village today, or likely tomorrow either. "I'm so sorry," Cecily said, and she meant it for every possible reason. "Don't be," Mrs. Alderton said, with that same careful expression. "The house could use the company." She met the Duke of Ashford at 11 o'clock in the morning, in the corridor outside the library. He was taller than she had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected. She had formed no picture of him during the night because it had seemed presumptuous to imagine a man she had never met in whose house she was stranded, through no fault of either of them. He had dark hair and a face that was handsome in the way that certain landscapes were handsome, impressive, severe, and not particularly interested in whether you appreciated it. His eyes were gray. He was carrying a book, which he was reading while walking, which was how they nearly collided in the corridor outside the library door. He stopped. She stopped. He looked up from the book. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Miss Hartwell," he said. It was not a question. Mrs. Alderton had told him then. "Your Grace." She stepped back and gave him the curtsy the situation required. "I owe you an apology and a great deal of gratitude. I'm afraid I have imposed on your household most thoroughly." "You were caught in a storm," he said. "That is not an imposition. That is weather." It was such a precise and unexpected thing to say that she almost smiled. Nevertheless, he looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes, which were unreadable in the way that deep water was unreadable, not empty, just too far down to see the bottom. Then he said, "The roads will be closed for several days. You are welcome to the library." He gestured at the door behind her. "I use it in the mornings. The afternoons are yours, if you like." "That is very generous," she said. "It is practical," he said, and walked past her down the corridor with his book still open in his hand. Cecily stood in the corridor for a moment after he had gone. Then she turned, opened the library door, and went in. The library was extraordinary. 2 stories of books lined the walls, a rolling ladder on a brass track, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and 3 deep chairs arranged near the windows that looked out over what was, under the snow, presumably a garden. She stood in the middle of it and turned slowly, and something in her chest that had been tight for a long time loosened slightly. She spent the afternoon there. The pattern established itself without discussion, which was somehow more comfortable than if they had negotiated it. He used the library in the mornings. She used it in the afternoons. They ate dinner at the same table because there was only one dining room, and it would have been absurd to do otherwise. And they talked, carefully, at first, in the way that strangers talk when they are aware of the strangeness. About books, about the storm, about nothing in particular. He was not warm exactly, but he was not cold either. He was precise. He said what he meant and did not say what he didn't. And after 2 days of it, Cecily found this quality so restful that she could have wept. She had spent most of her adult life in rooms where people said things they didn't mean and meant things they didn't say. And the straightforwardness of him, this man who told her the library schedule and called her presence weather and did not once ask her about her family or her prospects or what she intended to do with herself, was something she had not known. She was hungry for. On the 3rd day, she found him in the library at 2 in the afternoon. She stopped in the doorway. He was at the window, not reading, just standing with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes on the white expanse of the garden below. He did not hear her immediately, and for a moment she saw him as he was when no one was watching, still and very alone, and carrying something heavy in the set of his shoulders that had nothing to do with posture. She must have made a sound because he turned. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I lost track of the hour." "Please don't move on my account," she said. "I can come back." No. He stepped away from the window, and the moment, whatever it had been, closed over like water. I was finished, but he did not leave. He went to one of the chairs near the fire, and she went to another, and they sat in the same room in silence that was, somehow, not uncomfortable at all. She looked up from her book after a while, and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't name. He looked away immediately. "You read very quickly," he said. It sounded like an observation he had not intended to make aloud. "I always have," she said. "It used to drive my governess mad. She thought I was skimming." "Were you?" "Never." She paused. When a story is good, I can't slow down. It feels like running downhill." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The architecture of his face didn't seem to arrange itself easily into smiles, but something adjacent to it. Something that suggested the machinery for smiling was present and occasionally considered. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's exactly what it feels like." She looked at him for a moment, this severe and solitary man in his extraordinary house with its snow-buried garden and its 2-story library, and she thought, there is someone in there. Behind all that careful stillness, there is a person who knows exactly what it feels like to run downhill inside a story. She did not say this. She went back to her book. But something had shifted, and they both felt it. The 4th day brought a partial thaw that froze again by nightfall, and with it came the information from Mrs. Alderton that the part for the carriage wheel would not be available until the roads cleared properly, which the local farmer, apparently the estate's informal meteorologist, predicted would be at least another week. "I'm so sorry," Cecily said again to Mrs. Alderton, who waved this away with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had long since made peace with the unpredictability of northern winters. "His Grace has asked that you join him for dinner properly this evening," Mrs. Alderton said, in the dining room, not the small parlor. The dining room was enormous, which made the two of them at one end of a table built for 20 feel simultaneously absurd and oddly intimate, like two people sharing a secret in a cathedral. He had dressed for dinner, which she had not expected. A dark coat and a white cravat tied with precision, and she was still in the plum gown that was too long, which she had taken in at the waist, with a ribbon, because she was practical about these things. He noticed the ribbon. She saw him notice it. He said nothing, which she appreciated. They talked about his estate, and then about hers. She had no estate, she explained. She was traveling to her cousin's because she had recently concluded a position as a companion to an elderly lady in Bath who had died in October and left Cecily with excellent references and no immediate employment. She said this plainly without apology, because she had learned that apologizing for circumstances you had not chosen was a waste of breath that could be better spent on almost anything else. He listened to this without the flicker of condescension she had learned to watch for. "And before Bath?" he asked. "Various positions," she said. "I'm competent at most things that don't require a fortune or a title." "That is a considerable range of competency," he said, and this time the almost smile was close enough to the real thing that she could see the shape of it. "What about you, Galpon?" she asked, and then caught herself. "Forgive me. That was impertinent." "No," he said. "It was direct. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment, turning his wine-glass by the stem. "I have been here for 3 years, mostly. Mostly. I go to London when I must. I come back as soon as I can." She considered this. "You prefer it here." "I prefer the quiet," he said. And then, as though the sentence had surprised him by continuing, "I did not always. I used to find it intolerable." She did not ask what had changed. She had the sense that he had not intended to say even that much, and that pressing further would cause him to retreat behind whatever wall he maintained between himself and the world. She had seen those walls. She had her own. "The library helps," she said instead. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "the library helps." They sat with that for a moment, two people who had separately discovered the same remedy for the same unnamed ailment, and the fire crackled between them, and outside the storm pressed its white face against the windows. On the 6th day, she found the music room. She had been exploring. The house was large enough that exploration was not only possible, but practically mandatory if one wanted to avoid spending the entire day in the same 3 rooms. And she had opened a door at the end of the east corridor, expecting a storage room, and found instead a room with high ceilings and 3 tall windows, and a pianoforte that had clearly not been played in some time, judging by the fine layer of dust on the keys. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she went in, sat down, and played. She was not brilliant. She was competent. She had the honest self-assessment of someone who had spent years being useful rather than impressive, but she loved it. And when she played, she forgot to be careful about anything, and the music moved through the cold room and out under the door and down the corridor. She did not hear him come in. She only knew he was there when she finished the piece and the last notes died, and she heard, in the silence, the sound of breathing that was not her own. She turned on the bench. He was standing in the doorway with his arms at his sides and an expression on his face that she had not seen before, open, unguarded, the careful composure entirely absent. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been somewhere very far away and had just returned. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I should have asked." "My mother played that piece," he said. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences. It had weight. "I haven't heard it in 4 years," he said. His voice was even, but only just. "Not since she died." Cecily did not say she was sorry. She did not say anything for a moment, because the moment required something more careful than automatic condolence. Then she said, "Would you like me to play it again? Or would you prefer I didn't?" He crossed the room and sat down in the chair nearest the pianoforte. A chair that, she noticed, was positioned at exactly the angle that would let someone watch a person playing without being seen from the bench. And he said, "Again, please." She played it again, and then, at his quiet request, again after that. When she finished the 3rd time, she sat with her hands in her lap and waited. "She used to play in the evenings," he said. "After dinner, my father would read, and I would sit on the floor near her feet and pretend to read too, but mostly I just listened." A pause. "I closed this room when she died. I thought it would be easier not to hear it. Was it?" "No," he said. "It was just quieter." She turned on the bench to look at him. He was looking at his hands, and the last of the afternoon light was falling across his face at an angle that made him look, for a moment, very young and very tired. "I'm glad the storm came," she said, and then felt the absurdity of it, and almost laughed. He looked up, and this time the smile arrived. Not the almost, not the adjacent thing, but the real one, sudden and undefended, and transforming his face so completely that she felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. "So am I," he said. "God help me. So am I." The 7th day passed in a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. She played in the music room in the morning, and he came and sat in the chair without being invited, which she found she did not mind at all. They had lunch in the small parlor and argued cheerfully about a novel they had both read, and she said things she would normally have kept carefully to herself, and he listened to all of them, and disagreed with 2, and agreed with the rest, and never once made her feel that her opinions were more than he had bargained for. Mrs. Alderton watched all of this with an expression of profound satisfaction that she made no effort to conceal. On the 8th day, he took her to see the garden. It required boots borrowed from Mrs. Alderton, and a coat that was too large for her, and a scarf she wrapped twice around her neck, and the snow was up to her knees in places, and it was the most purely enjoyable hour she had spent in longer than she could calculate. He knew every part of the garden. The rose beds buried under their white blanket, the old oak at the far end that his grandfather had planted, the frozen fountain at the center, that in summer, he told her, was loud enough to hear from the library windows. "You could hear it while you read?" she said. "Yes, it used to—" He stopped, started again. "It used to make the silence feel inhabited, less like absence and more like peace." She looked at him standing in the snow beside the frozen fountain with his breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she thought, he has been so lonely. Not the ordinary loneliness of a man between social engagements, but the deep structural kind, the kind that settles into the bones and becomes indistinguishable from the self. She had felt it too. She recognized it, the way you recognize a face you have seen in a mirror. "It will be loud again in spring," she said. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Hope and its shadow together, the 2 things that always traveled as a pair. "Yes," he said, "it will." They walked back through the snow in a silence that was full rather than empty, their footprints tracking back through the white garden side by side, and she did not think about the roads clearing or the carriage wheel or her cousin in Derbyshire. She thought about nothing except the cold air and the sound of their footsteps, and the particular quality of this man's company, which was unlike any company she had ever kept. That evening, after dinner, he asked her to stay and talk rather than retiring to her room, and she said yes without hesitating, which surprised them both. They sat by the fire in the large drawing room and talked until the fire burned low, and she told him about Bath and the elderly lady who had been sharp and demanding and secretly kind, and he told her about his father who had been the opposite, generous on the surface and cold underneath. And they talked about books and about music and about the particular cruelty of hope, which she had said once in passing and which he had stopped her on, asked her to explain, and listened to the explanation with the focused attention of a man who recognized the territory from the inside. Hope, she had discovered, was the cruelest weapon of all, she said, quoting herself back to herself with a slight self-deprecating smile. You can defend against most things, but hope gets in before you can close the door. Yes, he said. His voice was low. The fire was nearly gone and the room was all shadow and ember light, and he was looking at her with an expression that was no longer unreadable. It was, in fact, entirely readable. It was the expression of a man who had not looked at anyone like this in a very long time and was frightened by the fact that he was doing it now. She felt her breath change. Cecily, he said, and the use of her name, the first time, without title, without formality, landed in the room like something dropped from a height. James, she said, because Mrs. Alderton had told her his name and it seemed only fair. The silence stretched. The last ember in the fire gave a small, decisive pop and went dark. Neither of them moved. I think, he said carefully, that when the road's clear, I will be sorry to see you go. I think, she said with equal care, that I will be sorry to go. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, not with urgency, with deliberateness, the way you pick up something you are afraid of dropping. His hand was warm, and she felt the warmth travel up her arm and settle somewhere in the center of her chest. They sat like that for a long time, in the dark and the quiet, and outside the storm pressed on. The 9th day brought a visitor. Lord Hartley arrived on horseback through conditions that were either brave or foolish, depending on your perspective, and he was shown into the drawing room, where Cecily and James were playing chess. She was losing, but with spirit, and he took in the scene with the particular alertness of a man who had ridden an hour through snow for reasons he had not fully articulated to himself. Lord Hartley was James's oldest friend. He was also, Cecily gathered within the first 10 minutes, a man who had made it his business to monitor James's solitude with the anxious devotion of someone watching a fire that might go out. He was charming. He was warm. He asked Cecily all the right questions with all the right interest, and she answered them pleasantly. And then he said, with a laugh that was perfectly calibrated to sound offhand, I do hope Ashford hasn't been too grim a host. He has a tendency to forget that other people require conversation. He has been an excellent host, Cecily said. Careful, Lord Hartley said, still laughing. He'll have you cataloguing the library next. That's what he does with people he wants to keep occupied and out of his way. She kept her expression pleasant. I've been using the library quite freely, actually, and the music room. Something flickered across Lord Hartley's face. Surprise, and something else. He looked at James. James was looking at the chessboard, but his jaw had tightened in a way that Cecily had learned to read over 9 days of close observation. The music room, Lord Hartley said. Miss Hartwell plays beautifully, James said, without looking up. You opened the music room. It was not a question. Lord Hartley's voice had changed, the social warmth still present, but something underneath it now, something uncertain. The room was not locked, James said. Miss Hartwell found it. The conversation moved on, as conversations do, but Cecily felt the current of it running underneath the surface for the rest of Lord Hartley's visit. When he left, he could not stay, he said. He had only come to check that James was not buried under a snowdrift. He pressed her hand warmly and told James, in a voice that was too careful to be casual, that he was glad to see the house looking so well. James stood at the window and watched him ride away, and Cecily stood beside him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "He means well," James said finally. "I know," she said. "He has been worried about me." A pause. "He is not wrong to have been." She turned to look at him. He was still watching the window, the gray afternoon light falling across his profile, and she thought about what Lord Hartley had said. The library, the music room, the house looking so well, and she understood that these were not small things. These were the measures by which the people who loved James Ashford tracked his survival. "James," she said quietly. He turned. His eyes met hers, and there was nothing unreadable in them now. They were entirely transparent, which was clearly costing him something. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "Do you? That the roads will clear soon, that you have a cousin in Derbyshire, that this—" He gestured at the space between them, a small, precise gesture that somehow encompassed everything that had accumulated over 9 days, "is a circumstance, not a choice, that what people feel in storms is not always what they feel in ordinary weather." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you think?" "I think it is what I should think, Arden," he said. "I think it is the sensible position." "And what is the other position?" He looked at her for a long time. The gray light shifted. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked. "The other position," he said, "is that I have talked to you more honestly in 9 days than I have talked to anyone in 3 years. That you walked into my library and my music room and my frozen garden, and you did not treat any of it as a curiosity or a performance. That when you played my mother's piece, you asked me whether I wanted to hear it again, and the fact that you asked—" His voice, which had been so careful, roughened slightly. "No one has asked me what I wanted in a very long time." She felt something crack open in her chest, wide and irreversible. "Someone should have," she said. "Someone should have asked you what you wanted, and no one did." He crossed the small distance between them and took her face in his hands, and she let him. And when he kissed her, it was not tentative or experimental. It was the kiss of a man who had made a decision and was committing to it entirely, and she kissed him back with everything she had kept careful and contained for years. And outside the storm finally, quietly, began to slow. The 10th day was clear and cold and heartbreakingly beautiful. The snow lay undisturbed over the garden and the roads and the world, and the sky was the particular blue that only exists after a storm has spent itself. And Cecily stood at her bedroom window in the early morning and looked at it and felt the terror arrive. The roads would clear. The wheel would be repaired. She would go to Derbyshire. She had no claim here. She had no position here. She was a woman of no fortune and no family connections who had been stranded by a storm in a duke's house for 10 days, and whatever had grown between them in the library and the music room and the frozen garden was real. She knew it was real. She was not a fool, and she was not romantic in the way that required self-deception, but real was not the same as possible. She was still standing at the window when Mrs. Alderton knocked and entered with a breakfast tray, took one look at her expression, set the tray down and said, "Don't." Cecily turned. "I beg your pardon?" "Whatever you are thinking at this window, Mrs. Alderton said, with the authority of a woman who had managed this household for 20 years and had no patience for unnecessary suffering. "Stop thinking it." "Mrs. Alderton." "He came downstairs at 6 this morning, Henda," the housekeeper said. He never comes downstairs before 9. He walked to the window in the front hall and he looked at the road and then he came to find me and asked me when the wheel would be repaired. She paused. He did not look like a man who wanted the answer to be soon. Cecily looked at her. He has not been well, Mrs. Alderton said more quietly. Not since his mother died. He has been here, and he has been present in the physical sense, but the house has been like a held breath. And this week, she stopped, started again. This is the first week in 3 years that it has felt like a house where someone lives. Cecily sat down on the edge of the bed, because her knees had made a unilateral decision about this. I don't know what the right thing is, she said honestly. The right thing, Mrs. Alderton said, is usually the thing you're most afraid of. She found him in the library. Of course she did. It was morning. It was his time. And he was standing at the window again with his hands clasped behind his back. But this time he heard her come in, and he turned immediately, and his face when he saw her was entirely unguarded. The farmer says the roads will be passable by tomorrow, he said. I know, she said. Your carriage will. I know. He was quiet. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, and they looked out at the brilliant white garden together, the frozen fountain at its center, the old oak standing in the snow. I told you, he said, that I would be sorry to see you go. You did. I find that was an understatement. He turned to face her, and his gray eyes were direct and serious and very clear. I find that sorry is entirely inadequate to the situation. Her heart was doing something complicated. James, I know what you're thinking, so, he said. I know the arguments. I have been making them to myself since 6 o'clock this morning. You have no reason to trust that what you feel here is what you would feel out there, in ordinary weather, in ordinary life. I have been isolated for 3 years, and I am aware that makes me not a reliable judge of my own feelings. He paused. These are all sensible arguments. They are, she agreed. I don't care about them, he said. Not even slightly. He took her hands, both of them, the way he had that first night by the dying fire, deliberately, carefully, as though he was holding something he could not afford to drop. I know that we have known each other for 10 days. I know that the storm created this. But I also know that the storm did not create you. It only put you in front of me. And his voice broke slightly, and he let it. What she understood was an act of courage for a man who had spent 3 years maintaining perfect composure. I would very much like to keep you in front of me, if you would consider it, if you would consider staying. She looked at him for a long moment, at his hands holding hers, at his face, open and afraid and entirely sincere. The storm will end, she said. Yes. And the roads will clear. Yes. And we will have to be real people in the real world, with all the ordinary complications that entails. I am aware, he said. I find I am willing to attempt the ordinary complications. She felt the smile begin somewhere deep in her chest and work its way up. You said you prefer the quiet. I have revised my position, he said, and the smile arrived on his face too, that real, undefended smile that rearranged everything. On what constitutes quiet? She stepped forward and he wrapped his arms around her, and she rested her forehead against his chest and felt his heartbeat, rapid and honest and entirely human. And outside the sun was coming up over the snow-covered garden, and the sky was that impossible blue, and the storm was over. They were married in April, in the small church at the edge of the estate, with Mrs. Alderton weeping with dignified competence in the front pew, and Lord Hartley beside James, with an expression of profound vindication. The garden was beginning to come back, the first green shoots pushing through the cold earth, the rose beds stirring. And when they walked back from the church through the grounds, Cecily could hear faintly the sound of the fountain starting up again after the long winter. James heard it too. He stopped walking and tilted his head, and she watched his face as he listened, and she saw the things she had seen in glimpses over 11 days of snow and fire and slowly opening doors. The man underneath the composure, the person who had been waiting inside the careful stillness for someone to ask him what he wanted. "There it is," he said softly. "There it is," she agreed. 2 years later, on a Wednesday afternoon in November, another storm came off the moors. Cecily was in the library, hers now, theirs now, reading in the chair nearest the fire, and their daughter was asleep in the nursery upstairs, and James came in from the garden where he had been walking with the particular purposefulness of a man who had rediscovered the pleasure of being outside in his own grounds. He was cold and slightly damp, and he sat down in the chair across from her and stretched his feet toward the fire and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with those gray eyes that she had long since learned to read as fluently as any text in the extraordinary room around them. "It's going to be a bad one," he said. "The roads will close." She looked up from her book. "Terrible," she said. He smiled. "The real one. The one that had taken 11 days and a great deal of snow to find. The one she had not known she was waiting for until it arrived." "Tell me again," he said. She set down her book. "A Wednesday afternoon," she began, "and the storm arrived without warning. Outside, the snow began to fall. Thank you for staying until the very end. Cecily and James began with a broken wheel and a buried road and 11 days of nowhere to hide, and what they found in that time was not a circumstance. It was a choice, made quietly, over chess and cold gardens, and a piece of music played 3 times in a room that had been closed for 4 years. If you believe in the kind of love that builds itself out of honesty and shared silence, and someone finally asking what you want, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next story. There are more impossible loves waiting, more hard-won choices, more storms that turn out to be the best thing that ever happened. You are the reason these stories exist, and I am so glad you're here."